Rudy, I'm pretty excited to have you on today on the podcast because, I think, in reading a little bit about your bio and reading a little bit about your background, I think we share sort of a similar background, both being from Texas. I grew up in the Rio Grande Valley area myself.
Oh,
Sounds
really?
like you grew up near the border too, right?
Yeah, I did. I grew up in the Rio Grande Valley in Brownsville.
Yeah.
In fact, have I was curious about your if you were maybe from there because I grew up knowing quite a few Alanis,
Oh, yeah.
family members that were kind of like distant relatives from like the Matamoros, Tamaulipas area and that kind of relatives that sort of stay closer than what the genetics probably are, but they stay like family, almost like family, and like just long multi-generational family friends. So I
Yeah.
was curious if you were from down there.
Yeah, actually, and I still have family down there. So when my parents immigrated to the states, that's where they ended up first, was in that area because my dad's family was from that area, and there's still people, that's still part of my family still there.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, we grew up there, like in a little town called McCook, which you probably heard of, in Edinburgh. Edinburgh, Texas is a
Uh-huh.
bigger town that's
Yeah.
connected to it, and right next to McAllen, well, Brownsville and all of that.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's been a little while since I've actually
That's
lived
awesome.
there, but that
Yeah.
immediately when your publicist reached out, that was one of the things that drew my attention. I was like, oh, okay, this is cool. I want to talk to this guy, see what he's about, and learn more about his book. So, having said
Thank
that,
you.
if you can kind of share a little bit about your personal background for those of folks that haven't had the opportunity to read your bio and learn more about you, if you could share a little bit about your personal bio, that'd be great. I think to kind of start us off.
Sure thing. Sure thing. Well, first of all, let me just say thank you for having me here, Juan. I really appreciate it. And Yeah, it's wonderful, like, to get to talk to someone who has a similar background, shared experiences. So for me, I was born and raised in the Rio Grande Valley in Brownsville, Texas, actually, and had family on both sides of the border, Matamoros, Tamaulipas, and Brownsville, Texas, and so grew up with a very fluid kind of binational, bilingual experience there. Spent a lot of time with family members in Mexico growing up, and even for about 6 or 7 years, my parents moved to Matamoros to live near my maternal grandparents, so they could kind of all help each other out.
Oh, wow.
And so I got to live like those years, pretty much full time in Matamoros, although
I
I
imagine
was
that was a little bit of a shock for you, right?
it really was, it was different. I didn't question it at the time, but it was, I think, a real, eye-opening experience and a really good experience to get to have friends that were, you know, I mean, growing up in Mexico, speaking Spanish, and with a very different outlook than the friends I had on the U.S. side of the border. And
Hmm.
and then I was commuting on a daily basis with a handful of classmates that would go to school in Texas, and we would like carpool together, cross the bridge every morning, and go to class at this little Catholic school, and then one of our parents would pick us up at the end of the day and take us back across. And back then it was like a 10-minute commute, maybe. Now it's obviously way longer because of security and
Oh,
the long
yeah.
lines.
It's hard to get through the border these days.
Yeah, so back then it was very, like I said, seamless and fluid and very interconnected. And so I grew up there, and I loved reading and writing, and it was always a dream of mine to write stories and hopefully write books. Another dream I had was to go to Harvard for my university, education, and I was fortunate enough to make that happen, and got to go there. So when I graduated from high school in Brownsville, I went to earn my bachelor's and master's degrees up there at Harvard, and continued to study, among other things, literature and creative writing, and continued to work on my writing over the years. So many years later, I'm grateful looking back at all those experiences, because in a lot of my writing, I really see those experiences coming through, both growing up on the border, our culture, our heritage, and then also just the ability to put it together in words, and get it out there, share it with people. Thanks a lot to the education I was able to obtain.
Yeah, no, and I just received your early version of the, or what do they call it in the industry? I guess what's the proper terminology for the early
Oh,
version of your book?
yeah, the advanced reading copy.
Yeah, the advanced reading copy, and I just started reading it, and yeah, I mean that's so true because I mean it you can definitely tell the fact that you grew up in the area, the fact that you kind of your cultural history and experiences are kind of are coming through in what your words are expressing in the book. So it's really fascinating to see that. Um, so a question for you: Your second generation, right? Are you Mexican American?
Yeah, yes, I'm Mexican American. So I was born in Texas. My mom was a Mexican citizen actually at the time, and my dad was the first generation on his side born in the U.S. So um, I was kind of like first generation
You're
from
like a
my mom,
hybrid.
and second, yeah, second from my dad. So 1.5, and it really felt that way. It really felt that way because since my mom's parents still lived there in Mexico, and they never moved to the U.S. I just had that very good fortune of spending a lot of time over there with them, and just having a real full binational experience. So when I look back at that, I'm just very grateful. I always felt it was special growing up, a special place, the border.
Hmm.
You often hear in the news today, nothing but negative stuff about the border. And that's one reason I like to share our stories, is because I feel like it helps give, people a more nuanced view of the reality of the fact that life is complex down there, and it's rich with culture, and there's wonderful people, and there's a lot of good things that can happen and that are happening
Hmm.
on the border, not just bad things, but the bad things are the ones that tend to make the evening news.
Right. And I brought that up about, kind of what generation you fall into because, you mentioned that part of your goal was to become a writer and the other goal was to go to Harvard. And, being, familiar with the area of the Rio Grande Valley, and kind of you're alluding to kind of the negativity gets a lot of attention in the media and other places, right? About the lack of, or the problems that are happening in the valley. So, coming from that area and kind of having those some would consider big aspirations, what do you attribute that to? What do you think, kind of from a young age, it sounds like, gave you the idea or the vision to say, hey, you know what, I want to be a writer and I want to go to Harvard?
Well, I think it was really books,
Mm,
and my mom was an avid reader. She really got me into reading at an early age. She herself had been a really good student. She
mm,
didn't go to college because it just wasn't in the cards for her, I guess. And she was growing up in a very traditional type of culture and household and whatnot. But she had graduated valedictorian of her high school class,
nice.
and she loved reading, and so she got me into it early on. And I just remember as a little kid, one of the things I would do was, you know how hot it is in the Rio Grande
Oh
Valley,
yeah.
so I would like hide out in the school library and nice air conditioning, and I would, just read books. And I found this little shelf, this area in the library. I remember when I was in maybe third grade or something like that, where there were all these biographies, like a series of biographies of different, famous historical figures, and I started reading them, and they were written for elementary school level, but as I read them, I started seeing like this name Harvard would pop up in different people's biographies. Maybe it was like presidents,
Mm,
other like big thinkers and scholars and whatnot. And so I thought, I started asking questions, started thinking like, hey, if you want to, I started equating the idea of making a difference in the world, making a mark in the world. For me, I started to equate that with going to Harvard, and that would give me that kind of opportunity to do something special. And that's kind of where the seed got planted. And I would tell people that, and a lot of people, they would classmates or even some teachers, they would kind of like, laugh a little bit because it just seemed a
Mm.
little bit outlandish.
Oh, like you're
Um,
you're you're dreaming too high, right? Or too
yeah,
it's
yeah, it seemed
it's a
like a
very
little bit of
lofty
a
goal, it
crazy.
sounds like, right?
Yeah, it seemed a little bit crazy, like a crazy goal. But
Yeah.
just like my mom put the books in my hands, my dad really put dreams in my head, and he was a big dreamer, and he was the first in his family to go to college.
Mm.
His parents had been like orphans from the Mexican Revolution, basically, and come to the United States and worked very hard. His dad was a blue collar worker, and my dad was the first one in his family to go to college, and he became a pharmacist that graduated from UT Austin.
Mm.
And so he always told me, like, dream big, go for it, don't hold back. If that's your dream, you can accomplish it. If another person can accomplish it, so can you. What's so different about somebody else?
Yeah.
And so that combination, of dreaming and getting the education, it just really harmonized really well for me, and I started to get some traction, early on.
Yeah, no, I think that it's interesting what we learn from our parents. That sometimes it's intentional, and sometimes it's kind of happens without them really intending for us to learn those things. They don't set out to be like, this is what I'm going to teach my kids. But like for me, like when you say that about your parents, it makes me think that for me, like I feel like I got I'm an entrepreneur, so I feel like I got that from my mom, because my mom was always like, whether she was selling, or cleaning houses or doing whatever she needed to do to make an extra dollar for the household. And then my dad was a hard worker, so I'm like, to me, I inherited those things. I don't know that they set out to teach those things to me, but I do. When I think about it now, I'm like, well, where did I get these traits from? I always think back to them, and I split it like into, I can see this from my mom and I can see this from my dad, and those things that kind of shaped me. But I'm curious, what type of books was your mom reading? Was she reading like fiction, or was she reading nonfiction books?
Yeah, she really loved fiction, and from an early age, I think, as a young girl, she really got into reading. But I think, and maybe you can empathize with this. Growing up in the valley, we didn't have a lot of money to take trips and like family vacations and things like that. So I mean, most of the time we were just there, in Brownsville, and it was a little bit like, it felt a little bit unchanging, almost like a little
Yeah,
bit monotonous in a way.
yeah,
And I think back to like the 1940s and 1950s when my mom was growing up. I mean, it must have been even more so because you didn't have. I mean, you had even fewer resources.
and she
You
grew up
had
in that
even.
area.
Yes, she
Oh
also grew up
wow,
in Matamoros and Brownsville. So
wow,
it was very limited, I think. So for her, books were just a form of escape. I feel like it was the way to see the world. It was a way to experience something beyond the life that we were living there, in this place that was special, sure. But I mean, when you never get to leave it, you kind of leave it. You can leave it through books.
yeah.
And back then that was the main source of entertainment, I suppose, when she was growing up. So she loved, those kind of books, and I remember her always telling me she liked pirate adventures and pirate stories. And if you think of like Jules Verne, the 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, like, so it's a little bit of science fiction, even,
Yeah.
um, early science fiction, that I remember she liked all that kind of stuff. And so she put those kind of books in my hands at an early age, and I also like became fascinated with the stories and the ability to imagine different places, and different characters and different ways of living.
Now, when you set out to go to Harvard and you got accepted and you went and to study, was it always your intention to eventually become an author, or was it you were looking to be a writer in some capacity and then you kind of fell into writing, or an author?
I was very interested in it. I think I thought it would be something that I would do, but not necessarily exclusively that. I was interested in other things. I was really interested in government and public policy. I was also really interested in international relations. Having grown up on the border, and I was interested in languages and travel, which I got to do quite a bit of during those years. And but it was really during like I took a literature class in Spanish, because I was fluent in Spanish, but I was noticing that my vocabulary was getting a little bit rusty, being up there in the Northeast for
Mm,
a couple years. not having as many people to speak with in Spanish.
Mm-hmm.
And so I asked for advice, and they said, "Hey, since you're fluent, the language classes are going to be too easy for you. But if you take these literature classes in Spanish, like you'll be reading in Spanish, and then you'll be talking to students in Spanish, other students, practicing." So I did that, and when I took that class, I started reading like these amazing Latino and Latin American authors who I had never read in like school growing up. They didn't have those authors on the curriculum like
Mm-hmm.
in the Texas schools, at the time. And I fell in love with these stories and the style of writing and seeing, my culture, my community like represented in the stories I was reading. I was connecting with the reading in a way I never had before, because
Mm-hmm.
before it was a little bit, when you're reading something about a kid growing up in like the early 1900s in London, England, it's harder to connect or
Right.
relate. You still
Right.
can, because there are universal truths in those books, but just harder to connect. So
Do you remember any of the authors that you were reading that really kind of you connected with?
yeah, for sure. I mean, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, 100 Years of Solitude and Love in the Time of Cholera were the first really, like, they were like, like lightning bolts for me that just
Yeah.
sort of totally changed how I thought about books and novels. And I suddenly thought, hey, I could get into this. I mean, I can write about my background, about my heritage, about stories I heard from my grandmother about the Mexican Revolution, or
Mm.
stories I heard from my dad about growing up in the 50s, on the border, in an era when, there was still, the discrimination was just very, very intense. And Other authors like Octavio Paz, who's a Mexican poet who
Mm.
won the Nobel Prize. And when I read his poetry, I was like, wow, this is, it was, there was this saying that I remember the professor telling me, which was a saying that he said was popular in Mexico, which was that dicen que la conciencia de México en paz descansa, which is kind
Mm.
of a funny double entendre, which means like the conscience of Mexico rests in peace.
Mm-hmm.
But Paz is Octavio Paz's last name, means peace in English. So
Oh,
it was
there.
a funny thing. He really captured in his poetry a lot about the culture, a
Mm.
lot about the political dynamics of Mexico, and the cultural dynamics of being a country that was built on both the collision and the combination of the indigenous cultures and the Spanish culture.
Mm.
Um, so yeah, I just like fell in love with what literature and writing could do, in those classes. And it's funny, I know I'm not the only writer that has felt this, but that this experience of having to grow up in a very Latino predominant place, like the border, but
Mm-hmm.
then have to leave the border and go to a place like Massachusetts to really discover what I could do with my culture,
Mm.
uh, through writing, was kind of fascinating and intriguing.
But it's almost like you have to remove yourself and take a step back and to really be able to see, what your experience is and how that connects to where your path is leading you, right? I mean, that sounds like it anyway.
Yeah, that perspective helps you see things a little bit more clearly, and then also helps you realize that there's value that you can bring others who aren't familiar with the culture or the geography or the history. You can bring them something of value by sharing these stories with them.
So at that point, when you kind of rediscovered these authors and you started falling in love with the style that they were using and what they were writing about, did you at that point already know, okay, this is going to be kind of my focus area that I want to write about? And did you start sharing that with maybe some of your professors or some of your mentors that you were maybe working with at that point? And what was their reaction if you did?
Yeah, I was very fortunate. I had a mentor that was a professor who of Latin American literature, and he was there at Harvard. And then after I graduated, he went on to be head of the literature department at UCLA.
Mm.
And that professor, Efraín Cristal, he he really took me under his wing, and like he even helped me apply for some grants to support doing research and doing creative writing. And so that was really fantastic because, I mean, I was around some students who had a lot of resources where they could travel to places and, get inspired and do research and spend time writing and not have to worry about, how to pay the bills. I had to kind of, figure out how to make ends meet a little bit, and
Mm,
also how do I do this, and so he kind of showed me the ropes a little bit about, like, applying for grants and making that kind of opportunity happen. Um, and then after that, I just kept writing. I kept writing through the rest of, really I continued to write. So it just
that's great.
became a process of building sort of a track record doing it. Submitting short stories to literary journals, and eventually getting an agent, and eventually, finding a publisher. So it is
Nice.
a long process, but for anybody who's out there who has those kind of dreams, I mean, I gotta encourage you, because if you stick with it, you will eventually make progress. It does take a lot of patience.
Okay. But nobody ever was like, I don't know, writing about the Mexico US border, like, does that really make sense? Did you ever kind of encounter any of that? Like people
Yeah,
were
it's
like,
funny.
we're not really sure if that's the best, like it's gonna be the most marketable thing.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned that. Well, sure. I mean, there's a lot of it's difficult industry to break into.
Hmm.
So there are two types of, I guess, obstacles that I tended to find. One was that there's a certain style of writing, that creative writing, fiction writing, that is sort of in vogue.
Mm.
It's popular, with literary critics and like with a lot of publishers in the United States, and it's a very it tends to be like a very specific writing style. It tends to be a little bit very realistic, very dry, and kind of a
Mm.
little bit like a little bit
Seco.
stark. My writing style tends to be more lyrical, more in the magical realism style, and so it kind of really reflects the very vivid, very passionate, culture, that Latinos, come from. So that's a kind of an obstacle a little bit, because sometimes, it clashes with the expectations of people who are making decisions when it comes to what are we going to publish.
Hmm.
Um, the other thing was, like, I remember still my agent many years ago. Basically, my first novel had come close to being published, and then he came back and he said, "Oh, he's very disappointed." And he's like, he basically told me that the head editor of this major publishing house had ended up saying that, the book was great, but they couldn't publish it because, Hispanics don't read. This was the this was the feedback from
Oh,
the
you gotta
publisher
laugh
in New
at that.
York. This is like 20 years, 20, 30, almost 30 years ago. But, my
Well, I
agent
mean,
was like so frustrated, and,
and it's not
it
funny,
was,
but it's just like it's comical that people would believe that.
yeah, yeah. I found it comical. I was like, well, I'm Hispanic, and I grew up reading, and, I saw my parents reading. I saw my
Hmm.
grandparents reading.
Yeah.
So maybe people would read more if they could find stories that appeal to them, and
Right.
it's similar to why nowadays we are seeing that, in at least in the entertainment world of music and TV and movies, like, you see now more representation, because people, realize that it's for their own benefit in their businesses.
Yeah.
And however, in the publishing world, it's been slow to evolve, but I think it's also making progress. And the fact that my books are out there and they're not the only ones by Latino authors, is a good sign. It's still a little bit of an uphill battle, but part of the process is getting more and more Latinos into the industry, because it's kind of not an industry that our parents traditionally sort of encourage,
Hmm.
kids to go into, because it's not an industry we know a lot about, because, not a lot of people in our families have worked in publishing. So
Oh
it's a
yeah.
process that takes time.
And I think that's why it's important to kind of have people like you out on the forefront a bit more, because I even for myself, I when I was growing up, I remember when and I started my career as a journalist. And I always liked writing myself, and I've always been kind of a writer, as a hobby writer, I would say, hobbyist writer. But even myself, when I first started my career, I was like, when I thought about being a journalist, I was like, I don't want to be a starving artist. Like, that's not a real thing. Like, you can't make money like writing. uh,
Yeah, it's tough.
there's a lot of I think there's a lot of kind of people where we kind of limit ourselves in terms of like what we are able to go after. But so I think it's important for people like you to be out in the forefront a bit more, and to really showcase that, hey, you know what, it's not easy. I'm not saying it's easy, but it is doable.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely, and it's amazing. There's a lot of people out there that want to support, other young up and coming Latino writers. I was very blessed to have the support, not only of like my own family, my wife and children, but also like support from people who advocate for more Latinos to get published. There's, for example, in Austin, there's a Austin-based organization called Las Comadres para las Americas. I don't know if you've
Hmm.
heard of them,
Yeah.
but the founder of that, uh, nonprofit organization, a lady named Nora Comstock de Hoyos, she is a big advocate for Latino writers, and so she helped me early on,
Nice.
make some contacts and give me positive feedback on on my writing and things like that. Edward James Olmos, the famous actor, he
Hmm.
started a nonprofit organization called Latino Literacy Now
Mm.
quite a few years ago in LA. But that Latino Literacy Now promotes childhood literacy for Latinos, but they also do the International Latino Book Awards, and they recognize Latino writers every year, different categories.
Nice.
And so his organization's always been very supportive as well, not just of me, but like I said, of many Latino writers who are trying to share our stories with the world.
And as you said, it's needed and it's very much wanted. But before we spend too much time talking about our own little stories, I do want to talk about your book, The Valley of Shadows, and I have it here. And this is a
All
beautiful
right,
cover, by the way.
thank
I
you.
really like the cover, and like I said, I just started reading it, and I think I'm already like in like chapter 3 or 4, and I just got it yesterday. So I'm
Awesome.
like, I'm
Great.
very much, ya me enganchaste. Like, so my wife is like, "What are you reading?" And I'm like, I just got this book. I'm talking to the author a little bit later. I was like, it's really good. I
Well,
like the
thank you.
fact that it's kind of like a western, but placed in the Mexico U.S. border. So tell us a little bit of set us up a little bit for those that haven't heard of the book, aren't familiar with the book. Tell us about the Valley of Shadows and what it's
Yeah, well,
about.
I always wanted to thank you. I always wanted to write something, a book with with the word valley in the title, because being from the Rio Grande Valley, I just, I just felt like I had to,
Well, right now, when we were talking about the valley, I looked down and I was like, "Wait, this is the valley." I was like, "I wonder if that has anything to do with it." But I was like, "I'm gonna let him tell me."
Yeah, so that's part of it. But I mean, the book is actually set out in West Texas, but
Mm,
on the border as well, and kind of in the Big Bend, region.
mm-hmm.
And a lot of the book takes place in West Texas and also in Chihuahua in Mexico.
Yeah.
But then there are parts. The protagonist, the hero of the book, his name is Solitario Cisneros.
Mm-hmm.
He's a Mexican, former Mexican lawman who um, was originally from the Rio Grande Valley, and he had grown up on the Mexican side of the border down there. And so there are parts of the story, like his youth, that take place down there. Um, and the story basically follows him as he tries to solve a kind of a complex mystery that involves a series of kidnappings and killings
Mm.
in the small border town where he used to be the sheriff. But what happened was that the river shifted course, and this Mexican town ends up on the Texas side of the border.
Mm-hmm.
And so he's lost his badge and everything. However, the local sheriff, as you already know, I'm not giving you any spoilers, but
Right.
the local sheriff gets killed,
Yeah.
and he gets pulled out of mothballs. He gets lured out of retirement
Yeah.
to try to solve this mystery before more people die and the town kind of self combusts.
Mm.
So it's to me, a lot of the inspiration came from actually my son. I have a son who's senior in high school right now,
Oh,
and
nice.
a few years ago, yeah, he asked me. He said, "Dad, he's always been really good about reading my stories." And a few years ago, he asked me, "Hey, Dad, why don't you write a? I'd love it if you wrote a Western horror story." And
Mm.
I was like, "Wow, that's interesting. I'd never written anything that was horror, and I never had written anything that was a Western." And I thought it would be an interesting challenge, for me, and to do it in my style. Like I said, my style is very, magical realism. It's
When you
not,
said Western, it made me think that it's Western, but it's also like vaquero. I would say.
yes, very much so, because I wanted to kind of turn the Western genre a little bit upside down. I grew up with my dad was a big fan of the old Westerns, like with John Wayne
Yeah.
and just the classic old Westerns. But he was also a fan of all those Mexican vaquero and charro movies like
Yeah.
Pedro Infante and Jorge Negrete and
My dad
all
was
those.
too. So
Okay, so you know what I'm talking about.
when I started reading it, that I like immediately like that's what I started thinking back to some of those like movies that he liked to watch.
Absolutely. So that's like the inspiration for the character Solitario Cisneros, this charro, who is very stoic. He's kind
Hmm.
of quiet. He's lost a lot in his life. The story has a lot to do with grief and isolation and pain that he carries with him. Um, but it's also a story that I thought would be interesting to place in the U.S. sort of Western kind of genre, because growing up watching the American westerns, the Mexican characters were always small sidekick, either comic relief or like they were a borracho, that was
Hmm.
kind of, or a villain,
Yeah.
and same thing with the Native American characters. And so I wanted to do something where, hey, imagine if something like this could have happened, and the Mexican American lawman could be the hero, and the Native American woman could be the heroine. And of course, there's Anglo white settlers and townspeople and everything, and some are good and some are bad. But I wanted to kind of just sort of recast the idea of the Western, from this perspective. And I had a lot of fun with it. It was fun. It helped me be able to step into that world a little bit more easily, for sure.
And I like that you mentioned that because I was actually going to ask you about that, about making kind of the Mexicanos and the indigenous people in the story like center, like be the hero, but really be like full, not full characters, not just like one dimensional characters, but to actually be the focus, the centerpiece of the story. I think, is really great to read, but it's also really important, I think, especially you as a Texas author, to to think about, imagine this book being yeah, available in the Texas school system to be for kids to be able to read and to say, hey, you know what, it's like, there is a piece of that history that's connected to me, and it wasn't all it's not always just the bad parts.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a very important thing that you're mentioning. I just feel like it was interesting for me. One of the historical events that also inspired me when I was working on the book was the back in 1918 there was a tragedy called the Porvenir massacre,
Mm.
and for people who are not familiar with it, if you look that up, it was a terrible incident in which some Mexican and Mexican American American born boys and young men out in West Texas in a small border town of Porvenir were accused of stealing some cattle. And they were not given, like, there was no real evidence. They weren't given a proper trial. The Texas Rangers went in there and they rounded up 15 boys and men, and basically executed them
Mm.
in front of their families without any kind of trial or due process. And uh, there were many events like that throughout the Southwest with involving, the death of Mexicans and Native Americans that sort of went forgotten or swept under the rug of history for a very long time. And it took about 100 years before a monument was actually erected, like a historical marker erected
Wow.
for the people who died in the Porvenir massacre. So, a lot of our history, like you said, has been either forgotten or written out of the books. And so, to me, it was interesting to explore that a little bit, and also to wonder, like, could some of these things and these tragedies that keep happening today, even in our society, when it comes to minorities, and the social injustices that get committed against them, sometimes by law enforcement. Um, how different could that be if more minorities were in positions of power and decision making? And that's really what you see in the Valley of Shadows.
Mm. And there's a lot. The fact that you talk about the border and kind of how the border shifted and how it changed things, from like one day to the next for so many people in the story. And I think that's a very real thing. I think think often when we think about American history, we don't remember, or we don't tend to recollect all the things that the Mexican and Mexican American community has endured, during this time, during the creation of our society as it is today, as our country as it is today. There were a lot of injustices that happened, and I think that even though this is a fiction book and you're writing about, kind of from a fictional perspective about a character that's not real in real life. There are a lot of things that you're talking about or that you're writing about that are very real, and that deal with things that were very real, for us as Mexican Americans throughout our history.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. The um, the character of Solitario Cisneros, one of the things he's trying to overcome in the book is he carries a curse that is a family curse that affects all the men in his family. And the curse, as you'll find out, originated when the Rio Grande was named or declared the border between the
Mm,
two countries. Prior to that, the lands that he was growing up in that belonged to his family, like they were on both sides of the river.
mm-hmm,
But suddenly, when the river was made the border, um, Anglo settlers came in and basically took the lands that were north of the river. And this happened to a lot of Tejano families
mm-hmm,
throughout South Texas, where they lost their lands, and or the lands were taken from them at gunpoint, or they were kind of swindled, out of their lands.
mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, I think that there is a lot of history that we grow up not really aware of. Like when I was growing up in the Rio Grande Valley in the 1980s, I wasn't aware of any of this, any
Right,
of this stuff. And they
right.
weren't teaching it to me.
It's not talked about.
Yeah, it wasn't talked about. And then a lot of Latinos, grow up in very difficult circumstances. There's a lot of poverty, as we know, and we often don't see a way out. And I think getting some perspective, and context of historically how our community, has gotten to where it is, it can give us also some hope that we can also improve our situation. Like our situation doesn't have to be always down and out, so to speak. And sometimes you have to work towards how do you right the wrongs of history. How do you work towards progress? And one of the things that I always like to write about is trying to find common ground with other people of diverse backgrounds. So when you look at the character of Solitario in Valley of Shadows, he's not an angry Mexican. He's not like out to shoot all the Anglo settlers or anything. He's
Right.
trying to figure out, how do I make the peace? How do I help build an enduring peace? How
Mm-hmm.
do I work with the good, Anglo settlers and the Native American neighbors and friends, and how do we build a community that we can, survive in together, and not only survive but grow together.
Mm.
And that's what I like about Solitario. Is he's like this very quiet, pensive kind of guy, and he's good with the guns and everything, and he's got the holsters and the and the revolvers and everything, but he'd rather solve the problems in a peaceful way. And so I hope you keep reading, and there's some even magic, in the book, because the book isn't, like I said, in the magical realism style. So
Oh,
he
yeah.
uses some supernatural abilities and I guess magic, if you will, to solve some of the problems that he comes across.
Oh no, I'm definitely reading. I'm finishing the book because it's I'm already hooked. So I'm already hooked, and I'm already waiting for the sequel. So like
Thank you, thank you.
and you brought up, and I think I was reading in the materials about you that your own family kind of had like a belief in a family curse. Could you talk to about that a little bit, and kind of what how you
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's interesting, but I heard about it. I guess many years back. My father, he was one of five men, and in his generation, there were five boys and one sister.
Mhm.
And the five boys, like as he confessed to me, made their sister's life, pretty miserable. Back in the 50s, they were very classic macho Mexican, older brothers that just sort
Mm,
of made her life pretty challenging. And
right.
she was the one that basically told other family members that she believed there was a curse on the men in the family, because that it just seemed like they would self-destruct, and they would kind of like have a lot of hostility, a lot of anger issues, and also be very macho and kind of controlling and trying to control the women in their lives and everything.
Mm.
And so I thought about that, and I thought, of course, my first reaction was like, well, that's silly. But of course, the more I thought about it, the more I started thinking about how sometimes, um, you know, uh, how sometimes our culture and our experiences that are passed down from generation to generation, the way, like we talked about the positive things we learned from our parents a
Mhm.
little bit earlier, and sometimes though we also learn things from our parents that if we do them the same way, they might work against us.
Mhm.
And so this is kind of what I started thinking was happening in the family, was that there was a succession of very macho kind of men in the family that passed on that behavior to their sons, and then the sons, this is how they were with their sister and with their wives. And there were a lot of unhappy people as a result of this, a lot of heartbreak, and so I thought the curse is really that, the curse is this machismo, the curse is this pride and this arrogance. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized, part of it has links back to this history. There were a
Mm.
lot of people in that generation who were growing up, in the 50s, Mexican American, and they were being told, "Hey, you're not really American. You don't belong here." But then if they went over to Mexico, they were being told, "Hey, you don't belong here. You're a gringo."
Mhm.
So they were a little bit displaced, these men, and they were a little bit grasping for straws, trying to hang on to some semblance of self worth and power. And I think the machismo became a way of doing that.
Yeah.
Again, a curse, because in the end they destroyed all the good relationships in their life by being this way. And so the characters in my last two books, this book, Valley of Shadows, is a prequel to my last book, which is called The Resurrection of Fulgencio Ramirez. And in both of those books, characters deal with this curse, this family curse. They're related, and they're fighting basically the same curse and trying to overcome that curse. And the curse has a lot to do with growing as a human being, and kind of recognizing your faults, your flaws, and what parts of who you are that you need to work on to become a better person.
Yeah, and I really like the way that you explained that, because I think, it reminds me of what I guess now you would refer to as like multi-generational trauma, right? I mean that, as you talk
Right.
about the good things that we inherited from our families, but then also there's those traumas that we also have inherited, and that, as you were referencing earlier, that, if you don't deal with, if you don't change, can then impact the next generation. And so it's, there's a lot of self growth and self, I guess, assessment in a way that you have to do in order to kind of get away from that. And it sounds like that's part of what you're dealing with in these books.
Yeah, I think so. For me, I think writing, I never really expected it when I started writing, but it is a very therapeutic process, where you do process a lot of these multi-generational dynamics, that exist, at least in my writing, and for me, it's always an exploration of you trying to understand people that meant something very special to you in your life. You're trying to understand yourself, and then at the same time, you're trying to tell a story that entertains people, and that hopefully, when the people read it, like they also learn something from it, whether it's something they discover that resonates with them about their own life, or maybe it's for someone who's not from this culture, not from this region, like maybe it's basically like a trip, an immersion into that culture, into that region, and through it you hopefully gain empathy, and you gain more of an appreciation for Latinos from the Southwest, for the Mexican culture, and all of that, which I think are things that are desperately needed in the American society, so that hopefully someday America can be a place that kind of returns or lives up to that ideal of embracing people of different cultures and people coming from different countries, and of all those different facets of America being a vital part of what makes America special.
Absolutely. And so, what do you want people to know about Valley of Shadows besides what we've already talked about? I've been asking you questions, but what do you want people to know? To when the book is coming out. Besides, I know that we want to give them the date,
Yeah.
but we also want to. What is it that you, as the author, want them to know so that they can go and pick up the book and they can go and read the book?
Well, I think it's a book that can definitely be a step into another place and another time, and also really another dimension, really, because of the supernatural aspect. So it's really a great, I think, book to escape into, and be entertained. But I think it's also a great book to kind of learn certain things about how life was, in those days, um, and also though to a book, I guess, that shares experiences that I think will help you feel proud about, like, if you have a link to this culture or this heritage. I think I would think that you'd find some pride in some of what you will read in there. And if you're not from the Hispanic culture, I think that it'll just be just a great, eye-opening, surprising experience. Because one thing people love when they read something is they like to be surprised.
Mm-hmm.
And so odds are you haven't read a Western horror story that has magic in it and that has a Latino hero.
Right,
So
right.
so I think the surprising part is part of the fun, but part of what will hopefully make it memorable for people.
Yeah, and it drops or is released on September 20th, right?
Yeah, on September 20th, the book comes out, and like you said, it's called Valley of Shadows, and it's available pretty much every major bookseller, online, like Amazon.com or
Mm-hmm.
bookshop.org, or local independent bookstores. And then for anyone who is in Texas and is in either San Antonio or Austin, we're having on September 20th a book launch event at the Twig
Oh,
Bookshop
nice.
in San Antonio.
Awesome.
Yeah, that's in the Pearl in San Antonio, and then in Austin on September 21st at Book People,
Mm-hmm.
on Lamar, the independent bookstore. And I'll be at both of those events,
You can meet,
answering questions, chatting about the book,
yeah, you
signing
can meet
copies.
Rudy and get your signed copy, right? That'd be awesome. Let's see, I'm over here trying to get this right.
Yeah, and you
There
see
you
that
go.
sombrero on the cover. That is kind of the big symbol of the hero, Solitario Cisneros. He wears the old charro
Uh,
uh, outfit and the hat.
that's
But as
awesome.
you can see, the hat is glowing, so it's one of his It's one of his secret weapons. So you'll see.
Oh, that's awesome, man. So this is great. I really appreciate you having the conversation. And I'm serious when I said earlier that I'm waiting for the. I do want. We look forward to the prequel or the sequel of this book, because I think it'd be great to kind of have a second part, and then it could be a series on its own, right? Because I'm
Yeah,
sure there are like
I
plenty of stories to
appreciate you
tell.
saying that. Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. I really thought of it. Usually, when I write something, I write it and the story's finished, and I feel like, okay, that's done, and gonna move on to something totally different. But in this case, because of the style, kind of the fact that it's a mystery and he's trying to solve this mystery, I really, got the feeling as I was writing it that this story could have legs, and that he could keep solving other interesting, challenges in future books, but also growing as an individual and continuing this journey that he's fighting kind of on his own epic scale with this curse that haunts him, and how that affects the relationships in his life and so forth. So yeah, I think there could be some follow-up stories, and I hope that does happen. But in the meantime, I think this is an exciting one to have
Yeah.
out there. And like I said, the other book that came out a couple of years ago, The Resurrection of Fulgencio Ramirez, you might also enjoy
Oh, I'm
while
gonna go
waiting
look for it. Yeah.
for the sequel. That one is related. It's in the same universe, but it's set more down in the Rio Grande Valley, more full time, and it is set more in the 1950s and 1980s. So it's a little bit more of a more
Oh.
recent history type novel.
Okay. Well, I'm definitely going to go pick it up and read it, because I think, I'm very glad that we were introduced, and I'm glad that I got to be introduced to your book, because I've been, there aren't, even though we said there are more Latino writers and more Latino authors, there aren't enough yet. So it's good.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. And there's always new ones out there waiting. So if some of them hear your podcast, I hope that that gives them some encouragement to share the stories. Sometimes, like, we all have like those family members that tell us those great stories, whether it's our, abuelos or abuelitas, or whether it's a tío or a tía. There's someone in the family that usually is a great storyteller, and like
Right.
that is rich material.
And what's next for you besides this book and the launch, and kind of going, I'm assuming you'll be on a kind of a media kick for it, but what happens after that? What's next for you? Are you writing more, or?
Well, yeah, I basically have like three other novels that are already written, that are on the shelf, that are waiting to be published. It's funny, I mean, for me, like, I'm all eager to get everything out there, but the way it all works, the industry sort of like holds you back a little bit, in the sense that they say, hey, one book at a time. You got to
Mm-hmm.
focus on that book. You got to, like, not only finish the book, but it's amazing how much time goes into the process of editing, polishing of it, and then the book publisher takes quite a bit of time on their own, like where they're getting it ready to be printed, designed, printed, distributed, marketed, the whole bit. So it's really something that takes time, and so then you kind of have to wait and go through that process and focus on letting people know about the book, and hopefully people buying the book, enjoying it, and then hopefully I'll get a chance to have one of the next ones released.
Yeah.
Um, and like you said, I have a lot of ideas for a sequel to this one. Um, the publisher hasn't committed to the sequel yet, but hopefully the book does well enough that they get excited and say, all right, let's do a sequel. I also think this one would be great for the screen, like an
Oh yeah.
adaptation for the screen,
I didn't
because
know
of the.
I wanted to mention that, but I was like, I don't know. Sometimes I know writers are not so crazy about that, so I was like, let me not say.
Yeah,
But I
no,
was
I
like, I can
appreciate
see
it.
this as a series, or like, a series or a movie.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the things about my writing style, that it's very visual and it's very cinematic. So I like the reader to be able to really visualize the story and the scenes, and picture the characters there, and so I think because of that, it really lends itself to an adaptation where it could be a movie, or a TV, a TV series. And then I also think, because of the genres of Western, and also the suspense horror kind of element, I think that it's something that would transfer well uh, to the screen.
Definitely, I think does lend itself to be on the screen as well, and I think that's really hopefully something that we get in the future. I know there's a lack of Latino, great Latino content on our also on the big screen and the small screen.
Yeah, and a lot of that goes back to books and writers. Books inspire a lot of the content we end up seeing on TV, a big percentage of it. And then, of course, just in Hollywood, you need to they need to embrace over time more and more, bring in more Latino writers, more writers from different backgrounds, and so their stories start, and the stories of their communities to start kind of making it to the screen. But in this case, I just think it's the kind of story that I feel kind of modernizes the Western, and I think in that sense, I think it would find an audience because it would kind of revitalize interest in that genre by a more diverse audience.
Yeah, and I think, and I think it's important for the viewers, for the listeners. I think it's important for us to support, and to show that because that's a great way to show that there is interest and there is need there. Because, if we go out and we're able to purchase the book, if we go out and we're able to show, hey, you know what, there's a big market for this, then it only opens the door even wider for bigger opportunities and for more individuals and more stories to be told. And to have the series of this novel, to really have a series that comes out of it, and who knows what other stories are yet to be told there. So I think it's important for us as Latinos and as a community to really support our authors and those folks who are at the forefront, really kind of leading that charge.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I totally agree, and in my sense, like I try to do the same. I know I'm just one voice out of many that we're trying to be heard, and like the more we support each other, lift each other up, the better. So one of the most rewarding aspects of getting to be a published writer is I've had the opportunity to meet a lot of other fellow Latino and Latina writers that are out there, many of them in Texas, and it's a real nice small community, but we support each other and we read each other's books, and try to show up at each other's events and things like that, and it makes a big difference because you don't feel like you're alone, and the more that community grows and the more readers there are for it, it's a good thing to see because it's all positive, I think, for our community.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's been a pleasure talking to you, Rudy. I appreciate your time and you all sending your team sending me the book early and allowing me to read it, because I think, I'm so happy to share the stories just because I do feel very connected to the border area and the fact that it's featured in this book very strongly. But thank you
Well,
again.
thank you very much. And let's stay in touch and let me know what you think when you read a little bit more of the book.
I'll definitely do
I
that.
will tell you that if you ever do get around to that other novel, The Resurrection of Fulgencio Ramirez, uh, the character in that novel, Fulgencio Ramirez, is inspired by my own father,
Oh,
and
nice.
stories my dad told me about his growing up and his experience on the border back
Oh,
in the
wow.
50s, and then also what I witnessed, when he was older. And one of his closest friends slash distant relatives was, he called him el compadre. He was his compadre, but his last name was Alanis.
Oh, really?
So I changed the name in the book to, because I always change the names a little bit. So I changed his name from Alanis to Alazan. But if you get to read it, if you see the compadre Alazan in there,
That's the
it was actually an
Alanis.
Alanis in real life that
Oh,
inspired his character.
oh man. Talk about what is it? Very few degrees of separation, 6 degrees.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it is a small world for sure.
Yeah. All right. Well,
Well,
thank you
thank you so much
again.
for having me
And
on your podcast, Juan.
absolutely. And when the next book is out, we'll look forward to talking to you.
All right, I appreciate it. Good luck
Uh,
with all your endeavors.
all right. Thank you. Likewise.
Thank you.